Okay, well, I too would like to welcome you to our winter orchestra concert. The students have been working really, really hard, and we have a really awesome program to present to you tonight. The first piece on the program is extremely famous and familiar. It's The Sleigh Ride by Leroy Anderson. And this piece was written in Brooklyn in 1948. And strangely enough, Sleigh Ride was premiered by the Boston Pops Orchestra in May of that year. So we're playing it in December, maybe a more timely performance. And we hope that you'll enjoy it. Sleigh Ride. So while the band students are getting situated, let me tell you a little bit about the next piece we're going to perform. This is kind of an interesting piece, and it has a bit of an epic story attached to it. It's called The Idols of Pegasus, and it tells the story of the adventures of a horse that can fly, the winged horse Pegasus. So when the piece opens up, you hear it's like kind of soft and gentle, and Pegasus is just being born. But then after a little while, Pegasus realizes that he can fly, and he takes off. And he has tons of cool adventures just flying around. I mean, how many flying horses do you ever see in your lifetime, right? So he's having such a great time, but everybody that sees Pegasus says, man, I'd like to capture that horse and ride and fly in the sky. So everybody tries to capture Pegasus, but he's too sneaky and nobody can get him. But finally, a prince named Bellerophon comes along, and he's able to make friends with Pegasus, tames him, and they go on lots of fun adventures together. And at some point in the music, you're going to hear like a weird kind of a melody, because they'll be encountering a monster. And the monster is kind of unusual. This monster is a chimera, and it's a fire-breathing monster that is part lion, part goat, and part serpent. And it's pretty deadly, but they're able to defeat the chimera, and they go on a lot more journeys together. At the end of the piece, it gets quiet again because it's the music is reflecting the constellation Pegasus that you can still see in the night sky. If you look up, you'll see the constellation Pegasus. So it sounds like a starry sky. So we hope you enjoy the Idols of Pegasus. It's a modern piece, and I think it's really enjoyable for the orchestra students to perform. the students kept telling me, is there a movie? And I'm like, no, there's no movie, but there needs to be a movie. It just sounds like it should be the soundtrack of a movie. So the next piece we have for the orchestra is called Darkened Shadows. This is a very interesting piece too. It's kind of edgy, it's very modern, and we started practicing this piece back in the fall. And in the fall, like the way that the light changes and the shadows are kind of darting around, and it almost seems a little eerie at times. It seemed perfect for this music. So yeah, just imagine you're seeing a lot of weird shadows. You don't know what's behind the next corner, and it's going to happen. So here we go, Darkened Shadows. so we had a little scene change, and the group you see in front of you right now is the chamber orchestra. And the chamber orchestra plays additional pieces to what we play in orchestra. So we have a beautiful piece called Fantasia on Greensleeves by Ray Vaughan Williams, British composer. And he wrote this piece based on a melody that was written very long ago, like in the 1580s, very old melody. And it's very beautiful. The arrangement includes flutes with keyboard and strings. So we started the concert with a very big group, and each group gets a little smaller until we bring the big group back again at the end. The group you see in front of you right now is called Camerata, and the Camerata plays without a conductor, which I really enjoy because a couple of reasons. I like coaching the students to be able to communicate through eye contact and body language and feeling the music together. And they work very hard on this piece, the Beethoven Quartet in C minor. And the second reason I really enjoy the Camerata is because I get to sit in the audience and watch. So sit back and enjoy Beethoven Quartet in C minor. groups keep getting smaller. This is the smallest group on the program. And this is our string quartet. And they'll be playing an arrangement of Last Christmas. And I noticed on the program, really, all the pieces are originals. There's almost no arrangements. And that really speaks so well to the students that they're able to play the original works and not something that's simplified or watered down, but what really was written by the composer. This particular arrangement is by the Vitamin String Quartet. They do a lot of pop covers. And I saw that they'll be performing at MPAC in the spring. So if you want to go see the Vitamin String Quartet, they'll be right in town. So take it away, quartet, when you're ready. All right. I always tell the students that the most stress I get for the concert, honestly, is that everybody's in a chair. So right now it looks really good. I'm very excited about that because once the music starts, they know exactly what to do. We've been rehearsing and practicing, and we look good and we're gonna sound great. So we have two more pieces for you, and these are both super great pieces. Before we play them though, I'd like to thank a few people who make our program possible. So I'd like to thank Dr. Ann Mucci, who's our superintendent of schools, and the Board of Education for supporting music in all of the schools in the Morris School District. I'd like to also thank Mr. Manning, our school principal, Mr. Polino, who's our music supervisor, and my amazing colleagues, Mr. Gallagher, and Miss Scott, our choral director. And they make coming to work every day just delightful. They're so much fun to work with. So again, thank you for coming tonight. We love having an audience. It's much more fun to play the pieces when someone is watching and cheering us on. The two pieces we have at the end, first we have Hava Nagila. Hava Nagila is a traditional song, and it translates to let us rejoice, so it's a very happy sounding piece. The second piece is Leroy Anderson's Christmas Festival. So we started with the Leroy Anderson, we end with the Leroy Anderson. And that piece was written in, the Christmas Festival was written in 1950, and it was premiered by the Boston Pops Orchestra in June of that year. So interesting, again, we're more timely with the performance being in December. So we hope that you'll enjoy Hava Nagila, followed by a Christmas Festival.
tonight. We really loved having you as our audience. Have a wonderful holiday season, drive safely, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the week and it's year to come.